It is a dreary cell of stone, cold and moist as a vault sheltering the insects, mildew matted on the walls, and rats scampering in and out of shadow, and frightful screams operating like echoes through the torch-lighted walks. So, just picture yourself going through this as a woman, not as a soldier or a hard criminal, simply a woman who happens to be guilty of little to nothing more than poverty, or suspicion, or being in a place she should not have been, or at a time she should not have been there. Prison was not the medieval world as we imagine it now. There were no sentences with steady routines that lasted long-term. The purpose of the prisons was mainly to be holding grounds, somber relay stations for those awaiting trial, sentence, or ransom. So to women these were especially hellish places. Not only were they regarded as criminals, but they were also valued as moral degenerates who deserved neither respect nor protection. So, it is time to take a glimpse of the dreadful truth about women who were locked into the iron ramparts of medieval justice. It is important, first of all, to comprehend that always the prisons of the Middle Ages were not organized to take into consideration the needs of women. The majority of jails, in terms of castle dungeons, city gaols, and ecclesiastical lockups, were male only. Female prisoners had little or no proper facilities. When women were jailed, they were shoved in together with the men, and it did not matter which crime or how weak a female was. The result of this cohabitation was usually gruesome. Abuse in the form of being physically and sexually assaulted was common. A legal historian, Barbara Hannawalt, writes that in 14th century London, jailers regularly extorted sexual favors in return for food, water, or even latrine privileges. The jailers in most instances posed more of a threat than the crimes with which the women had been charged. Who were those women? As opposed to the common popular images, the majority of female inmates were not witches or traitors, but were peasants, widows, or vagrants. Most of them were arrested for stealing bread, a piece of cloth, or some firewood. Others were charged with prostitution, heresy, or non-payment of debt. It is important to mention that the law in medieval times treated women as guarded by men, either husbands, fathers, or lords. What happened when a woman walked out of the roles prescribed to her, even a little bit? Her action might be seen as deviant or even criminal. The historian P.J.P. Goldberg writes that even aggressive women may have been found threatening, particularly in the towns where social mobility was threatened. Those who had no male defenders were easy to arrest. Quite a lot of medieval prisons were semi-private. Jailers did not get paid, but they got fees for prisoners. Nothing was free. Bedding, food, water, chains, and even the release of chains. The system was a trap to the women, who did not generally have the means or contacts to pay off bribes or fees. In 1293, a woman called Alice of Bath was imprisoned in the Newgate prison in London. Her crime? She had already taken a little and was unable to pay for it. Her family was not influential, and she was chained so that they could not feed her for days, but could only sleep in a sitting position. It was not an extraordinary case when she suffered. Even the noblewomen were not spared. Duchess of Gloucester, Eleanor Cobham, was charged with suspicion of witchcraft in the year 1441, and she was immured under harsh conditions, initially in the Tower of London, and later transferred to the secluded island and remote castle in the Isle of Man, known as Peel Castle. She was isolated and humiliated, despite her high birth, and her reputation was ruined beyond repair. In England, torture, though not as frequent as in some of the countries of the continent, was fatal when inflicted. Female prisoners could not be tormented regularly by following the criteria adopted by the court of law, but they also underwent demeaning penalties and psychological torture indefinitely. A scold, or gossip, had been a crime in numerous towns, and one of the more notorious means of dealing with such was called the scold's bridle, or the branks. This iron muzzle was clapped on the head of women, with the tongue being sandwiched between a metal bit. The idea was to be quiet and be ashamed. To humiliate them into submission, women were exposed naked to the streets, to be paraded like animals tied on a leash. Although this was not necessarily applied in prisons, this kind of punishment was also within the general penal life most women had already undergone. Elsewhere, suspected women were whipped naked and inspected for traces of witches' marks, moles, scars, or blemishes, supposed to show a deal with the devil. Such tests, which were done in the name of the law, were nothing but legalized infringement. The least pleasant accounts include pregnant inmates, due to the possibility that women might be arrested at any time. Some women gave birth in prison. The situations were dreadful. Sanitation was almost zero. Classes related to the use of midwives were dissimilar. The spread of the disease was very quick. An example of such is one in Norwich in 1325, wherein there is a document stating that a woman known as Maud had been imprisoned because she stole something together with her unborn child. She ended up delivering on her own, in a chill cell, and she, along with the baby, passed away within a few days. The cause? Starvation, poverty, and abandonment. All she had done was to steal bread to feed her own children. Parenthood was not the only thing. There are cases when mothers were imprisoned along with their children. Unimaginable conditions were a part of the existence of infants and toddlers, and they were treated as the containers of rats, lice, and adult prisoners' diseases. This was not a case of individual acts of inhumanity, but rather a continuing pattern of systematic inhumanity. The agony was worse in case of the women who were charged with political or religious crimes, such as treason or heresy. Anne Askew, a Protestant reformer, was imprisoned and tortured in the Tower of London in 1546, and many other such women were confined there as well. Her story, although a bit beyond the time frame of the generally accepted medieval period, deserves a mention because it puts the violence of states into extreme accent. Though of gentle birth, Anne hung on the rack, which was generally an instrument of the masculine gender. At Smithfield she was not able to walk and had to be carried there to her execution. Her crime? Spreading outlawed religious thoughts. Her case shows how the female inmates were perceived not only as law violators, but also as dangers to the patriarch to play around with. The purpose of punishing them was to regain control of morality, faith, and gender. However, in this dismal world, not all women were helplessly beaten by males, and some stood up, not necessarily by fighting, but by surviving. In medieval prison records, we sometimes find petitions, written or dictated by female prisoners, appealing on grounds of justice or mercy to be treated kindly. These snippets of their speech are terrifying. An example of a petition by a woman is by Claricia in 1383, being written in jail in Bruges. She did not ask the magistrates of the city to be set free, but she asked with tears only to be given bread and straw to lay down upon. It is a strong message. These women, with everything taken away, including dignity, in a world that had anything to take, still insisted on being human. Reforms started to appear in the late Middle Ages and the early stages of the Renaissance. Certain prisons were directed to segregate men and women. Voluntary organizations, mostly religious, aimed to be able to feed or advise female prisoners morally. The primitive notion of prison as rehabilitation even started to be formed. These were, however, very small and not consistent changes. The severe conditions, such as overcrowding, sexual exploitation, and neglect, that were the essence of what assistants had to put up with, kept on persisting well into the time of early modernity. The medieval jail was the reflection of the outside world, hierarchical, patriarchal, and ruthless. At least as far as women were concerned, it was rather inhuman, deprived of personal autonomy, deprived of security, and being regularly humiliated. They have little to tell about medieval attitudes to gender, authority, and morality. We can also not forget about these women as victims only. There were those who survived with great bravery. Others wrote, protested, or prayed. Some merely hung on to be disobedient in itself. The next time that we are driving fast and pass a ruined castle, or look at a dungeon on a museum visit, then we may ask the question, who are the women who are forgotten behind those walls? What yells did they hear in the darkness? And is it not so much a modernity that there is no longer a world that not only does not repay what women do, but who they are?